Okay, Harry Truman, we're back. And a reminder that you've just heard that communist forces of North Korea have invaded South Korea. And in fact, in the hours since the first report came in, we've learned that the North Korean forces, the communist forces, are pretty much having their way. The South Korean army is reeling. Refugees are pouring south from Seoul, the South Korean capital, which is pretty close to the dividing line between North Korea and South Korea. And they are fleeing for their lives. And it looks as though, unless the United States takes strong action, the South Korean government is going to fall. That what happened in China, a communist takeover of China, which, I'll remind you, was in the summer and autumn of 1949. Now we're in the summer of 1950, so less than a year ago. Communism took control of China. Now it looks as though communism is on the brink of taking control of South Korea. Another major victory for communist forces in this unfolding Cold War. So, President Truman, what are you going to do? Well, a little bit more background. Harry Truman, I don't have to remind Harry Truman of this, but I'll remind you. Harry Truman was at first an accidental president. He was vice president to Franklin Roosevelt when Franklin Roosevelt died, and he suddenly became president of the United States. He was unversed in foreign affairs. There were some very big issues of foreign affairs he knew nothing about. As vice president of the United States, he was not told about the Manhattan atom bomb project. And after he became president, the Secretary of War had to bring him aside and said, Mr. President, there's something I need to tell you, and explain to him about this top secret project that was building this weapon that might be something the world had never seen. And Truman thought about this and, okay, wow, that's a big deal. Truman was stunned by becoming president. He told reporters that he felt as though the sun, the moon, and the stars had come on upon him. He had never expected to be president, but here he was. Anyway, so for the next, for 3.5 years. So he became president sort of shortly into what would have been, what was Franklin Roosevelt's fourth term. And so he had about 3.5 years as president, as this accidental president, I call him. But he had a chance in 1948 to run on his own, to run and to see if he could become president in his own right. He did get the nomination of the Democratic Party in 1948, but it didn't look as though that nomination was going to be worth a whole lot because the Democratic Party fractured as Southerners who were staunch segregationists and didn't like the fact that Truman had ordered the desegregation of the military and seemed to be much more advanced on civil rights than those white Southerners wanted to be. They split off and formed their own party. And furthermore, the economy had gone through ups and downs after the end of World War II. So Truman looked like a long shot to win the election of 1948. In fact, the Republicans were so confident that they hardly bothered to campaign against Harry Truman. They mostly talked about what they were going to do afterwards, but not really focusing on Truman, who seemed hardly worth their breath or their ammunition. And one area in which they conspicuously did not take serious issue with Truman was foreign policy. Because at this point, the policies that America had adopted in the Cold War, basically, the policy was summarized in the term containment. The idea was that the United States would try to contain the expansion of communism. The United States would not try to overthrow the communist government of the Soviet Union, but it would try to prevent its expansion. And the Truman Doctrine was part of this, but containment was good enough. The American people did not want to start a new war against an old ally, against the communists. But if communism could be contained, then presumably, at least the thinking was, that communism would kind of die of its own weight sooner or later. Containment was good enough. And the Republicans, by and large, agreed with this. There was a group within the Republican Party that actually thought that even containment was a bit too much. There were some old school isolationists who were mounting a bit of a comeback, who said, this Cold War, it's way too ambitious. It spends too much money. It creates this excessively large government in the United States, and we really want to get back to the idea that the world is going to tend to its own problems because we've got enough of our own. So Truman looked like he didn't have much of a chance to win for election in 1948. To the surprise of everybody, maybe even himself, although he said not, definitely to the surprise of the Republicans, Truman won. And the result of this, what the Republicans were angry. They were just sort of kicking themselves for not having made a bigger deal of Harry Truman. And a substantial group of the Republicans decided, okay, enough of Mr. Nice Guy. We're going to wage political war on Harry Truman. And so they did. And they began pointing the finger of blame at Harry Truman, and especially, on domestic affairs, sure. That's what most Americans were interested in, but in foreign affairs as well. As I said, the attitude of many of the Republicans wasn't that different from the attitude of Truman and the Democrats, but they needed to show some separation because they were already revving up for the congressional elections of 1950 and then the next presidential election in 1952. And they couldn't just say, yeah, we agree with the Democrats. That wouldn't get them anywhere for political purposes. So they begin investigations of Harry Truman for this, that, and the other thing, including investigations of what they were calling the loss of China. So at the time the Truman administration said, we're not sending any more American aid to China. Let things in China, let the chips in China fall where they may. There wasn't a huge outcry in the United States. It seemed to be a reasonable approach. But after the 1948 election, after Truman's surprise upset victory, after the Republicans decided we need to get a stick that we can beat the Truman administration over the head with, then they decide, oh, this was a terrible idea, that Harry Truman conspired in the loss of China, as though the United States, the Truman administration, had lost to China, as though China had been America's or Truman's to lose. But this was the position they took. And so they contended that Truman was soft on communism, and that he was therefore a threat to American interests, to American security. Some members of the Republican Party took this to an extreme. Joseph McCarthy was a senator who loudly announced that communists infested the Truman administration and the State Department. And the reason that the communists had won in China, and the reason that communists were making gains in the Cold War, was not the merits of the communists, but the demerits of the Truman administration and all these spies, these commies in government. And thus began what at the time was called the Big Red Scare, sometimes the Second Red Scare, because there had been something very much like this in the period right after World War I. But in this period after World War II, the McCarthy Red Scare, it caused people to believe that they had to always say anything they could against communism, that school districts and universities and eventually Hollywood, they had to demonstrate that they were on board as being as anti-communist as anybody else. Because in those days, to be labeled as a communist sympathizer, the term was often, you were a pinko, because the communists were called Reds. The red was the color of their flag, and the red, the color of the revolution. And even if you weren't a full-blown communist, well, then you could be a pinko, so you were half communist. And teachers got fired, professors got fired, screenwriters in Hollywood got fired. This Red Scare, it just convulsed the country. And these kind of convulsions happen every so often in the early 21st century, where there'd be this sort of anti-terrorist scare. And it's not as though people just made this up. There was reason to be concerned. There really were communist spies. But there was also a strong temptation, often succumbed to exaggerate the threats, and that's exactly what happened. But anyway, Truman and members of the Truman administration found themselves beaten about the head by Joseph McCarthy and by other Republicans generally for being soft on communism. Soft on communism, you're soft on communism. You are betraying the interests of the United States. And this came to a head, as I say, after the communist victory in China. McCarthy announced his finding to the world, his discovery to the world, at the beginning of 1950. So China goes communist in the fall of 1949. In the early part of 1950, Joseph McCarthy bounces onto the scene and is waving his finger and charging communism, subversion, spies in the State Department everywhere in the spring of 1950. So this is the backdrop, this is the immediate background of the North Korean invasion of South Korea. Now, there is no reason to believe that the leadership of North Korea was paying any attention to what was going on in the politics of the United States. It's not as though Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea, was reading American newspapers or anything like that and say, oh, the Truman administration is vulnerable here, now we're going to take our chance. But it so happened that for reasons internal to Korea and among the larger communist movement, Kim Il-sung was a protege of Joseph Stalin, and Kim thought of himself as the George Washington or Simon Bolivar of Korea. He was going to unite Korea as Korea has not been united under Korean control, as Korea had not been united or under Korean control for, well, since the 19th century. So the Japanese had controlled the place for almost 50 years, and then the Americans had come in and occupied the southern part of Korea for the 5 years after the war. So Kim is going to liberate South Korea. That was the plan. And he was going to liberate South Korea under communist rule. So on the face of it, the United States might have been willing to go along with unification of Korea. This had been a goal of American policy for a long time, since just the end of World War II. But the fact that he was a communist, this was more than Americans could accept, and especially more than Harry Truman could accept. At this particular moment, again, Truman, since the election of 1948, we're in 1950 now, since the election of 1948, Truman has been pounded by the Republicans for being soft on communism since the fall of 1949. He has been blamed for losing China to communism. And now it looks as though, I'm not going to say he is going to lose South Korea to communism, but communism is going to take over South Korea while Harry Truman is president of the United States. He can see where this is going. And he can see that if South Korea falls to the communists, then he will be blamed even more. And so, partly for this reason, partly because Harry Truman believed, as many people believe with good reason, that a communist dictatorship was no fun to live under. So out of concern for the interests of South Koreans themselves, out of concern for his own political future, out of concern for the balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union, out of concern for the future of democracy, which seemed to be on the defensive against communism. Once again, South Korea was not a democracy, it was an anti-communist dictatorship. But as I said earlier, an anti-communist dictatorship was seen as better than a communist dictatorship because anti-communist dictatorships might evolve into something closer to democracy. At least this seemed to be the case. And communist dictatorships, no, they didn't evolve into anything. That was the thing, except communist dictatorships. So that was the thinking at the time. So, Mr. President, make your decision. What Harry Truman decided was he couldn't allow South Korea to fall to the communists, at least not without an American effort to stop it. So, he orders American troops sent to South Korea. American troops are in Japan. He orders the troops sent to South Korea to bolster the South Korean forces. Now, the thinking was not, at first anyway, to take over the war, but at least to give support to the South Koreans. This would have a number of important consequences, positive consequences from the American perspective. One is it would slow the advance of the North Koreans so the South Koreans could get their act together. That'd be one. It would show the demonstration, the resolve of the United States as the leader of the free world. And this is a term that's begun to being used at this time. The United States as leader of the free world. The United States is going to come to the aid of countries that are part of the free world, which meant the non-communist world, just as Harry Truman had promised the United States would do in his Truman Doctrine speech. So, this is what he says. Now, it also was just an accident of history, an accident of the moment, that Harry Truman was able to get the United Nations to give its seal of approval to a defense of South Korea. As I mentioned earlier, the United Nations had been born in 1945 with great hopes that this time the League of Nations would be able to do something, the new version of the League of Nations would be able to do something to preserve world peace. The hopes had quickly dissipated as the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War basically paralyzed the Security Council, the decision-making body at the heart of the United Nations, where the United States and the Soviet Union each had a veto against the other. And each one began vetoing stuff, especially the Soviets vetoing stuff that the United States wanted to do. And so the Security Council had become paralyzed. But there was a moment, and the moment just happened to be in late June 1950, right at the time of the North Korean invasion of South Korea, where the Soviet Union was not in a position to exercise its veto. This because in the wake of the communist victory in China, the United States had taken the position that the government of China, and therefore China's permanent seat on the Security Council, still rested with the government of Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists. The United States did not recognize the new government of China, the new government of communist China under Mao Zedong. And the Soviet delegate to the United Nations had stalked out in anger, saying, I can't deal with these people. And he was not present at the moment when word arrived that the North Koreans had invaded South Korea, which meant that he could not cast a veto against a resolution of the Security Council to go to the aid of South Korea. This was what collective security was supposed to do, to assist countries that had been attacked by rogue nations. So for a moment, but just a moment, the United Nations seemed to be fulfilling the hopes first Woodrow Wilson originally under the League of Nations, then Franklin Roosevelt, then Harry Truman, that the United Nations might actually be this force for world peace and to counter aggression. Now, the Soviet delegate quickly realized his error and came hurrying back to UN headquarters. And so this was the last moment on which the Security Council was able to make this kind of strong statement on behalf of the policy that the United States supported for it would be 40 years before the United States and the Soviet Union could agree on something similar to this. But anyway, it allowed Harry Truman to send U.S. troops to South Korea against North Korea under the auspices of the United Nations. And this was an important thing, because Harry Truman had been a strong supporter of the United Nations, and he said that the United States was simply doing the bidding of the United Nations. As a member of the United Nations, the United States was doing what the United States had pledged to do. This allowed Truman to do an end run around the question of, well, is this a war for the United States? Because Harry Truman did not want to ask Congress for a declaration of war. Americans were only 5 years away from World War II, and most Americans did not want a war in East Asia. They didn't want any other war. So Truman was able to send U.S. troops to South Korea without asking Congress for a declaration of war. A reporter said, so, Mr. President, what in the world is this? Is this a war? No, it's not a war. Well, what is it then? And somebody had suggested the term a police action. It's just like when a city government or a state government orders police or the National Guard into something to calm an uprising. And so Truman and the Truman administration adopted the position that this was a police action rather than a war. Now, this would have long-term ramifications for American policy. In fact, the United States did not declare war in the Korean War in the 1950s. The United States did not declare war in the Vietnam War of the 1960s. The United States did not declare war in the Persian Gulf War of the 1990s. The United States did not declare war in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in the beginning of the 21st century. So this idea of declaring official war, and specifically going to Congress to declare war, has fallen into disuse. The last declaration of war by the United States was in World War II in 1941. And since then, presidents have sent American forces into war, but have never actually asked for a congressional declaration of war. It certainly seems like an end run around, if not a blatant violation of the Constitution, which says that Congress shall declare war. Presidents don't get to declare war. So part of the reason was this historical moment of the Korean War, but the larger thing was, and the reason that wars have not been formally declared since, is that in the nuclear age, there is this belief that once the other side gets nuclear weapons, and by 1950, by the way, the Soviet Union had tested its own atom bomb, that in the nuclear age, there simply isn't time for Congress to debate about war, that the president might have to make decisions almost in a split second. And so it's a lot easier for one person to make a decision than for the 500 plus members of Congress to get together. Sometimes Congress is in recess and they have to call them back together. And in the nuclear age, a war might begin and be fought and end before Congress could come to a decision. But there's something else involved, and that is that presidents have found it very handy to be able to send troops where they want, when they want, without bringing Congress in on it. Now, you might think, political scientists, a student of politics would think, well, doesn't Congress object to this? And some in Congress did in 1950, in this moment, at the beginning of America's involvement in the Korean War. But members of Congress realized that there was an advantage to them as well, because Congress doesn't get any pats on the back, doesn't get any positive credit for declaring a war that proves to be a success. And, that's because the soldiers get it, the president, who's the commander-in-chief, gets all the credit. But somebody who votes against war, well, when you vote against war, a war that the president says is necessary, you risk looking unpatriotic, anti-American. Presidents always wrap themselves in the American flag during war. And for somebody to say, no, that's wrong, you can't do that, well, it's a political risk that a lot of members of Congress would rather not have to take. And so Congress really, only on a couple of occasions in the next, ever since, has Congress seriously tried to constrain presidents who wanted to send American troops into battle. And usually that was long after a war had gone sour, as in the Vietnam War, of which we'll talk later. Anyway, so American troops go into battle. And they don't have much luck at first. The North Koreans have this head of steam, and they push the Americans back, they push the South Koreans back. And it looks as though they're going to push the Americans and the South Koreans right off the tip of the South Korean peninsula. But then the American commander, Douglas MacArthur, one of the heroes of World War II, the supreme commander of Allied forces in the Pacific during World War II, has a brilliant scheme, a risky scheme. Its brilliance lies in its very riskiness. It's going to be an end run around the North Korean forces. And he's going to catch them by surprise in this very risky operation, an amphibious landing that does indeed take them by surprise and, in fact, changes the whole complexion of the war. The United States and the South Koreans had been about to lose the war. Now they're about to win the war. And, in fact, the North Korean army, most of which is in the southern part of South Korea, it's like it is about to be cut off and trapped. And it looks as though the war might end just in a matter of a couple of days. The North Koreans, once they realize they're about to be trapped, they stream back north into North Korea. But now it's the Americans under MacArthur and the South Koreans who have the head of steam. Now, here is a fateful moment. You are Harry Truman. You're the President of the United States. The Security Council resolution that authorized the use of American force in South Korea said only that member nations of the United Nations shall do their best to repel the invasion, to drive the North Korean invaders out of South Korea. It says nothing about invading North Korea. But Harry Truman, you have been being beaten around the head by your Republican opponents for losing China to the communists. Now, you see the possibility that you could win back ground from the communists if you allow Douglas MacArthur to go into North Korea. You could basically overthrow the communist regime of North Korea. And you could win back is an arguable term, but you could win for the free world North Korea. Korea could be united, not under communist control, as the communists wanted, but under, well, we'll call it non-communist control. We'll call it democratic, just to be very generous in the terms that Truman would have used. So it looks for a moment as though you're going to be able to turn the tables on your Republican critics. So Truman thinks about this. You are President Truman. What are you going to do? Are you going to tell MacArthur and his troops to go right up to the dividing line? It's the 38th parallel of latitude. Are you going to go right up to the dividing line and stop, according to the UN resolution? Or are you going to give MacArthur the go-ahead to keep going right into North Korea and to overthrow the communist regime in North Korea? What do you do, Mr. President? Well, Truman says, go ahead, Doug. Go right into North Korea. Because MacArthur is giving all sorts of promises. I can finish this war within a matter of days or a few weeks. And who is Harry Truman to gainsay, to second guess a military commander, a genius like MacArthur, including especially one who's just come off this brilliant maneuver, this end run around the North Korean lines. So he gives MacArthur the go-ahead. Go ahead, just go into North Korea, finish the job. And MacArthur and American forces drive north. Now when I say MacArthur and American forces drive north, MacArthur was not a battlefront commander. He guided the war from his headquarters in Japan. But nonetheless, he gave the order and the American forces went north. At this point, the plot begins to thicken, or at least get more complicated. I guess that means the same thing. So the plot thickens because the communist government of China has been watching all of this and didn't like the idea that American forces are in South Korea when the American forces first got there. And the communists in China, they're worried that the Americans are going to try to attack China itself, or that the Americans are going to encourage the Chinese nationalists on Taiwan to reopen the Chinese Civil War, because the United States is still supporting Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan. So the Chinese communists give warning that if the Americans approach the Chinese border, then China will not stand idly by. Truman hears these warnings and initially dismisses them. They're just bluffing, they won't do anything. And American forces get closer and closer to the border, the northern border of North Korea, which is the border with China. And MacArthur, the American general, MacArthur says, yeah, I can finish this off, we can finish them off. And all of a sudden, MacArthur gets whacked on the side of the head. He's stunned and surprised when Chinese forces enter the war, when the Chinese sneak hundreds of thousands of troops across the border into North Korea and launch a surprise attack on American troops. MacArthur was not ready for this at all. He thought, they'll never do this, they won't do this. But they did. And American forces now, once head south again, they're reeling back. And these were some of the worst defeats for American troops in military history. And they're driven back in the winter and the snows and the mountains of North Korea. It's a really bitter and dangerous time for American troops and for South Korean troops as well. At this point, Truman has to decide what to do. And, Americans now, we are closer to a full-blown World War III. Because at first it had been Korean forces against Korean forces. Then it was Korean forces against Korean forces with U.S. forces. Now it's U.S. forces. Now it's U.S. forces and Korean forces against Korean forces and Chinese forces. So the Communist Army of China is fighting against the Army of the United States in Korea. Will Truman escalate? Some people ask him, Mr. President, you've got the atom bomb. The Chinese don't. Will you use the atom bomb? Truman initially didn't want to tip his hand and say, no, I'm not, because that would seem to let the Chinese know they could do whatever they want. Initially he said, well, it's under consideration. This scared the daylights out of the world. It looked as though the world was on the brink of a nuclear war, because if the United States used nuclear weapons against China, as Douglas MacArthur, the American general, was advocating, then the Soviet Union almost certainly would have to use its nuclear weapons against the United States. And that really would be World War III. So Truman decides to back off from this. And over the course of, the war doesn't go nuclear. And the world breathes a great sigh of relief. The war in Korea is hardly over. It goes on for another 2.5 years. It's not till 1953 that an armistice is signed in the Korean War. And it's important to know that that armistice was not a peace treaty. It was just a truce. We're going to stop. And in fact, it's that armistice that still exists today. And it's one of the reasons that Korea remains a flashpoint in world affairs. There's no longer a Cold War, but there is a potential for a renewal of the Korean War.